This is my analysis for My Grandmother Washes Her Feet in the Sink of the Bathroom at Sears by Moshe. This literary analysis is intended for people like me, people who absolutely hate poetry, but are willing to give it a good faith attempt in order to try and gain a little bit more understanding from it, and maybe even like it at the end. We'll see. Moshe is a Syrian writer born in Damascus and raised here in the United States. She often features the dissonance between these two cultures, Muslim Americans and United States Americans. She writes novels, poems, all kinds of writings with Muslim characters. The reason I chose this poem is relatively simple. I chose this poem because I didn't absolutely hate reading it. It's the only poem that didn't make me want to rip my hair out of my head. And it's refreshingly direct. It's relatively simple at first glance, but I think that the poem is stronger because of its simplicity. The premise of the poem is pretty simple. The situation, a moment in time between these two parties, a Muslim American family, a grandmother and her granddaughter, as well as an unknown amount of other patrons here in the bathroom that don't understand the religious significance of food. On the first read, the poem is pretty straightforward about its meaning and the overall message it's trying to convey. It's not one that's full of hidden meanings or ambiguous phrases. It's refreshingly direct. The poem's tone initially feels pretty light and conversational, but there is an air of tension throughout it. It's a surprisingly mundane encounter at first glance, but at the end of the poem, when nothing big happens, it makes it all the better for that. Diving a little deeper into some of the things that make this poem impactful, let's go over the stanzas. Breakdown of how the words are separated. To me, the stanzas seem to indicate the end of one thought and the beginning of another. There's no real rhyme in this poem, but there is significance as to how they are broken apart. Let's take a look at this one phrase here and dig a little deeper into it. No one is fooled, but I hold the door open for everyone, and we all emerge on the sales floor and lose ourselves in the great common ground of housewares on markdown. To me, this reads as two separate thoughts, a double meaning of sorts. Here's the first thought. No one is fooled, but I hold the door open. And, on the other hand, no one is fooled, but I. The speaker is caught between these two parties, but is still choosing to hold the door open for everybody, maybe as a gesture of goodwill, maybe as a sign of respect. But on the other hand, the speaker herself might be the only one who's trying to fool herself when she refuses to translate the argument between her grandmother and the other women. They argue hotly, one in Arabic, the others in English, and the speaker thinks that the ladies can't really see past her shrug and awkward smile, but like the poem says, no one is fooled. There's a couple examples throughout the poem of how the stanzas are broken up to convey double meanings. It's interesting, and a great way to convey extra meanings between the words. The imagery throughout the poem is really intense. There's really interesting imagery and, specifically, contrast throughout the piece. There's a contrast between luxury and squalor, cleanliness and filth. The grandmother herself describes her experiences washing her feet and praying in some of the most beautiful and historic places in the world. The bathhouses of Damascus over painted bowls imported from China. The other patrons in the bathroom compare this act to one that's filthy and dirty, squatting in the mud over a rusty tin in a vaguely tropical squalor. This contrast is a great way to illustrate the two groups' perception on the grandmother sees this practice as correct, as clean, and one associated with religious devotion and beauty. The other women don't understand this behavior, and they see it as unclean. So these strong words are helping us feel that tension. They help us understand that this moment is them versus us, at least in the eyes of these two parties. One of the things that stuck out to me while I was reading this poem initially, and then deeply the second, was how the speaker refers to both her grandmother and the other patrons in the restroom. She's never overly embarrassed by her grandmother's actions. She's never outwardly hostile towards the other women. She doesn't think less of them, think more of them. She holds great respect for both of them, and seems to act as a sort of mediator between these two parties. In a way, as acting as the mediator between these two parties, she's almost being seen as the mediator between these two cultures, these two worlds. Here's a couple of words the speaker uses to describe her grandmother. Plump, matronly, well-groomed, delicate, and poor. On the other hand, the uses very similar words to describe the other patrons. Respectable, matron. She describes both of them with this phrase. All of them decent and good-hearted women, diligent in cleanliness, grooming, and dignity. Here's some words that the speaker uses to describe the scenario itself. Ritual, front, contamination, foreign, unhygienic, bluster and flutter, clash of civilizations, unrushed. All of these words, the descriptors, everything, these are words and phrases that are continuing to build the idea that this really is a clash between two very different worlds that are, when you strip them down, really not so different at the end of the day. These women are still in their own right, clean, beautiful, and good-hearted in this moment. To them, their differences seem to be all that is on their minds. To the mediator, she only sees good-hearted, diligent. Here's my fancy-dancy thesis. Mozhikov places the reader in the middle of a clash between two cultures and explores how societal norms affect our perception of each other. The poem builds this moment's tension with the choices of words it uses to describe the characters and the situation itself, the structure of the stanzas, and the contrasting imagery throughout this poem. On the surface, it's simple. An elderly woman is performing a religious ritual in a place where it feels out of place. But through Mozhikov's clear, conversational tone, the striking imagery, and even the way the stanzas are broken up to convey thoughts, we're shown that something as mundane as washing someone's feet can represent more. It's an act of devotion to some, an act of uncleanliness to a moment of pride amidst misunderstanding. At the end of the poem, nothing crazy happens. There's no big confrontation, no dramatic resolution. Everyone just fades back into the department store, but that's kind of the point. The grandmother doesn't need to justify her practices. The women don't end up leaving with this greater understanding of Muslim culture. And the speaker doesn't pick sides, nor does she really need to. Instead, Koff leaves us with a moment of stillness in the middle of cultural noise, reminding us that dignity, respect, and identity don't need translation. And maybe, if nothing else, that's why this poem works even for the haters. It's honest, it doesn't try too hard, and it leaves us all with something to think about as we too emerge on the sales floor and lose ourselves in the great common ground of housewares on markdown. Thanks for listening.